So I'm sitting here with Gary DeMar of American Vision, and I first want to say thank you so much for being on our podcast again. The last time you were on, it caused us some issues also.
Cost me quite a few, actually. It got me in, roped me into
And it
all
was
this.
not our intention whatsoever. But I had mentioned that I'd read Last Days Madness and how it had changed my worldview, and so that's why I wanted to meet you. And thankfully, Bob Cruikshank had introduced us, and so you came, which I think was very gracious. And I thank you for giving me your time today. I read your book, The Case for American Christian Heritage, and yet again, you have helped shape and change my worldview. I've said many times on our podcast that we do not live in a Christian nation, although I think that it has changed. We definitely, our foundation in our country was absolutely Christian, and throughout the years remained so. And the secularists did move in, and I remember Obama saying that we were formerly a Christian nation, now we're sort of an amalgam of different religions, and I understand that. However, I think in your book you make a great case that our heritage is key to our success as a nation. At least I believe that. And so thanks for being here.
Oh, thanks for coming to my home and
yeah,
doing
this is very cool. You have a very beautiful home.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me here.
Thank my wife. It's
yes.
Give me a room and a study and a bunch of books. I'm fine.
Yeah, I'm the same way.
This is her touch. So.
Yes, absolutely. So she's done a beautiful job. It's wonderful here. And for those who are listening to our podcast, they know that we're audio only. But we are shooting a video, which is kind of unique. We got lights, camera, action on us here. So I think Mr. DeMar will be releasing that somewhere, I guess, on American Vision or whatever at some point.
Yes.
Yeah, very good. So I want to start out with this. So we are talking about your book, The Case for America's Christian Heritage. And I wanted to bring out something that I read in chapter 2, and then let you tell me how you even came to write this book.
Okay, sure.
So you say, quote, knowing where to begin a study of a subject is often elusive. How far back do you go in history to say that it all begins here? In his book, Meet You in Hell, a telling of the partnership and rivalry between steel magnates Andrew Carnegie and Henry Clay Frick, Les Standiford writes, as is always the case when tracing history, there is no stopping anywhere. Truly, for seeking out first causes is something like following the warp and weft of an enormous knitted sweater. Pulling one string always bunches up another, and smoothing that only leads to the knot in the next. The same is true for determining the actual starting point of America's founding. Our nation begins not in 1776, but more than 150 years earlier, end quote. And I agree wholeheartedly with your point. Where does it all start, right? So I learned that in the Bible. Even in the Bible, as an early Christian, I was told to read the New Testament when I first became a believer. But as I grew in my faith, I learned that what I was being taught in the New Testament, I had to have the core and the whole of the Old Testament to understand it.
Yeah, when someone says they're a New Testament Christian, and
right.
I think, wait a minute, the very fact that you used the word testament, now you have to ask the question, what is a testament? Mm-hmm. And was there a previous testament? What makes this testament different?
Right.
And all the history involved with it all. I mean, no Christian can claim to be a New Testament only Christian. Mm-hmm. And it's the same thing historically in terms of the founding of founding of the Americas and the founding of the United States goes back a lot earlier than 1776, and even earlier than 1607 with Jamestown, and 1620 with the Massachusetts Bay Colony, because that worldview grew out of something that was predominant in Europe at that particular period of time, especially in Great Britain. And so do you go back to the Reformation, which 1517, Martin Luther, I mean, you can keep going back. I didn't go back that far. I basically assumed an already existing history that took time to develop and had not only theological and political and social consequences, but consequences related to the topic of Christendom. How far is the impact? What impact does a biblical worldview have on things beyond personal salvation? Mm-hmm. And you study the history of the United States, especially the early documents and people, why they came over here, that's foundational to understand the development of our nation and where we are today.
Sure. And that's, which brings me to, when I read this book, the amount of research that you had, you were just speaking off the cuff just now about Jamestown and the Massachusetts Bay Colony. When I was reading your book, you were going through like the constitution or the charters of each state or each colony that became a state into its own constitution. That took a lot of work. And in every one of those cases, God was mentioned.
Oh, yeah.
And so I was curious, what brought you to write this book in the first place? Like, I'm glad that you did, but so how did you get to that?
Well, I graduated from seminary in 1979. This was during the Carter administration. And Jimmy Carter came in as a born-again Christian, which was something new to the media. And I was raised Roman Catholic in the suburbs of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and you mentioned Carnegie and Frick. I mean, those were two guys in Pittsburgh. Mm-hmm. And no one ever talked about being born again. That just wasn't part of the vocabulary. And we really didn't talk much about religious specifics. We all went to church. We all considered ourselves, I guess, Christians for the most part. Even the one fellow down the street from us who's Jewish, we all shared the same values. And so through Jimmy Carter's administration, he was touted as a born-again Christian, Southern Baptist, or at least a Baptist. I'm not real sure. The Southern Baptists were going through some growing pains at that particular period of time as well. And Ronald Reagan comes along and he starts quoting the Bible. We're a city on a hill, goes into the New Testament and brings that up and says, this is what America was founded as. And so it was kind of a wedge issue with Ronald Reagan. And the media didn't know how to deal with that either. Because, again, 1960, it was a big deal that a Roman Catholic was running for president, JFK. I mean, that was a huge, huge deal. Mm-hmm. Because there was a lot of anti-Roman Catholicism in the United States. And the question was, will America be dominated and governed by the Vatican? And so JFK had to get up and assure people that was never going to be the case. Mitt Romney had to do the same thing because of it when he ran for president as a Mormon.
As a Mormon, right.
So
Senator Orrin Hatch was another.
Right,
yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. Another Pittsburgh guy, actually. All of these questions, you see, were brewing. But even with all of this, America was fundamentally Christian, even though people didn't really specifically talk about it. There was, I would call it a spillover effect. Christianity was so dominant in the colonies and later on, state constitutions and so forth, that it permeated society without necessarily acknowledging where it all came from. Mm-hmm. And so I'm an apologist. Not that I apologize for things, but I'm in the defense business. That's what the Greek word apologia means. It means to offer a defense. And so as questions were coming out, I felt I needed to address this topic. And so the first book I wrote was in 1982, which became the first volume of God and Government. And I had one chapter in there in the Christian history of the United States. And we produced a short audio called The American Vision 360 Years Later. And took us all the way back to Christopher Columbus. And in like 35 minutes, we traced America's Christian heritage in that tape. And won an Angel Award, actually. Voice talents, music, sound effects, and so forth. It was recorded in New York. And we still offer that today. So this was, I needed to deal with some of the secular arguments that were being made, and my first introduction to that was with this, the first volume of God and Government. Mm-hmm. Then, with that, I kind of was known, for America's Christian history, and I got a call from a local public broadcasting station here in the Atlanta area. They wanted me to come down. Not so much a debate, but it was more of a sit down with some ACLU attorneys and it was around Thanksgiving. And I jumped at the chance, and I'm going to pull this out here. I brought this book with me. It's called The Christian Life and Character of the Civil Institutions of the United States. And it was put together by a man named B.F. Morris in 1864. And this is, at the time...
And for those who are listening and can't see this is a very large compendium. Oh, and that's very small print.
There's very small print. Let me see how many pages this is. It's almost 900 pages.
Wow.
And this, remember, this is all done. This is almost, I'm going to say 80% original source documentation of America's Christian heritage. And this is done before, 1864. No internet, no word processing, no one's photographing anything. This was a monumental project. And over the years, I would get pictures from people who say, I was in Grover Cleveland's library, and this book was on the shelf. I've gotten 2 or 3 pictures from people who have seen this book elsewhere. At the time, this book did not exist for the general public in a hardback version of it. And so we republished this.
And you can get this on American Vision.
I get this on American Vision. It's called The Christian Life and Character of the Civil Institutions of the United States. And it is over 1,000 pages. It makes a great doorstop if you're interested on the utilitarian effect of this. But it is just filled with original source documents. The only thing I criticize about this book is much of this is not footnoted. I'd love somebody to take the time and spend a year or so just tracking down all the footnotes. But so anyway, I go to this powwow with these ACLU attorneys, and I had no idea what was going to happen. But I knew a lot, back in the 1980s about a lot of this because I had done a lot of research, and I took this Xerox copy with me. And I just held it on my lap. And I was just, and when you're doing kind of a debate, you can't cover everything.
Sure.
So all I said was, look, until you can answer the content of this book, you don't have a case. And they said, well, what is this book? And I said, it's Christian Life and Character of the Civil Institutions of the United States, published in 1864 by B.F. Morris. And they had never heard of the book either. And so this was kind of my introduction into this particular topic, but I wanted to do original source documentation. I wanted to say, hey, well, so-and-so said this, but where did he say it? Did he really say that? And so the first book I wrote on this was America's Christian History. And then I was asked by Dr. D. James Kennedy, who was the pastor of Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church,
which you went to. You told us that in your testimony.
Yes,
Yeah,
I went
to that church.
I went to Coral Ridge, and went to seminary from there and became pretty good friends with D. James Kennedy. And they asked me to do this kind of short version of America's Christian heritage. So I was a member of Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church. Dr. D. James Kennedy was the pastor, and he was a big worldview guy. A great preacher. If you've ever been to Fort Lauderdale, you'll see this massive, very, very tall, steeple church on North Federal Highway, 55 North Federal Highway. And he would often give sermons on America's Christian heritage and so forth. And by this time, I had written fairly extensively on it. On one book I did was America's Christian History, the Untold Story. And then I did a kind of a shortened volume called America's Christian Heritage, and it was full color and so forth. So I wanted to do something that brought together these books I had done in a way that was accessible to the average reader. And the high school kids and parents, they could sit down with their children, go through all this. And so we did this, The Case for America's Christian Heritage, which is a full color telling the story of America's Christian heritage. Footnoted, everything in here is, takes you back to original sources, which you have to do today. Anytime anybody's doing anything on any topic, you always want to go back and ask the question, where is that found? What's the context for this? And I remember doing a debate with a fellow named Edward Tabash on America's Christian heritage. And when I prepare for something like that, I put a big notebook together because you never know what you're going to be asked. And he gave this quotation, and I said, oh, I remember that quotation. So I turned to my notebook and I said, well, let me read to you the next paragraph that Mr. Tabash failed to read. And I read that next paragraph, and it just refuted what he had to say.
Oh, wow.
Context is everything. You know, in the Bible, you can string a bunch of verses together and come up with, something completely different from what the Bible actually says.
Yeah, you did one fun during your testimony about Judas.
See, Judas went out and hanged himself. Go thou and do likewise. Whatever you do quickly, whatever you do it quickly, for there is no God.
Yeah, let's string those together.
Right, those are all four Bible passages.
Right.
Well, we'll probably talk a little bit about this. The Constitution mentions there's a separation between church and state. I mean, how many times have we heard that?
Yeah, I've heard that.
Or the Treaty of Tripoli says the United States wasn't founded upon in no way was founded upon the Christian religion. So you've got to go back, and the Bible says, well, you're not supposed to judge. Matthew chapter 7, verse 1 says you're not supposed to judge. But verse 2 says, well, it's not that you don't judge, but make sure you're consistent in your judging. So this happens in everything, and it also happens dealing with America's Christian heritage. It deals with going back and looking at original source documents and see what they say about this particular topic. Now, at the same time, we have to be fair. We have to be accurate. So if someone says, well, we were a Christian nation, and someone says, well, you were not a Christian nation. So you have to define your terms. What do you mean by that? In fact, there was a book that was written, I think it was 1905, by a Supreme Court Justice, David Brewer, which title of it is The United States, a Christian Nation. And he was a Supreme Court Justice who ruled on a couple of cases dealing with America's Christian heritage. In that book, he says, look, when you look at the original source documents, you can't come to any other conclusion that foundationally Christianity was the basis of the founding of the United States. And it was the founding of the colonial era. You go back to the New England Charter, you go back to Mayflower Compact, if you look at Jamestown, they were specifically Christian. They weren't generally religious, they were specifically Christian. But at the same time, there was an Enlightenment entry into all of this. And we have to keep that in mind as well, because not all of the founders, at least the constitutional framers, we would call Christian. Thomas Jefferson is a perfect example of that. Benjamin Franklin is another one. Although it was Benjamin Franklin who stood up at the Constitutional Convention and says, unless the Lord builds the house, they labor in vain that build it, from Psalm 127. He says, if we don't follow that, we will do no better than the builders of Babel.
Yeah, and this was in 1787 when they were putting
1787.
They were putting it together, and
Right.
they were having all these problems. And Franklin stands up, and here's a man supposedly of the Enlightenment, or at least that's what we hear. But he was on the right side of the Enlightenment, and he brings in this. We used to pray. I think you put it in your book. He says that there was a time where we were at war, where we would be in this very room and we would pray to this.
Right, yes.
Yeah.
There are these, prayer, calls for prayer and thanksgiving were put out by almost all the presidents, early presidents, and many of them are specifically Christian. Mention Jesus Christ, mention the Holy Spirit, mention repentance, and so forth. And so that's all documented. I mean, there's no way of getting around that. But at the same time, there still was this Enlightenment entry coming in. It was popular at that time. But among the founders, as far as I know, there was no atheist. I mean, Thomas Jefferson was not a Christian, but he was no atheist.
No.
And the Declaration of Independence, in one respect, is more religious than the Constitution of the United States. But you can't understand the Constitution of the United States unless you understand the Declaration of Independence. And the two are actually wedded. And maybe when we get to the dating of the Constitution of the United States, when you read the kind of the tagline at the bottom, it links it to the Declaration of Independence. We are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. Mm-hmm. State doesn't give us those rights. Creator gave us those rights. Mm-hmm. And if there's one thing that the founders agreed on, that God was the one who gave us these rights, that it's not the privilege or the authority of the civil magistrate to give us rights. The civil magistrate was to protect those rights, and that's why we write constitutions. And it was Thomas Jefferson said, we need to chain people down to the Constitution so they don't go in there and create government in terms of power and authority and money, which we have today, because we've gotten away from this transcendental belief that God exists, has given us laws, and we no longer have an ultimate authority. Well, all of those founders, all of them, there may have been one or two, but all of the original founders believed that God was the fundamental giver of all these rights, mm-hmm. even though they may not have been Christians, even including Thomas Jefferson. So from Thomas Jefferson to Paine, you find this idea of Thomas Paine came out with his book Common Sense, and Common Sense was used for the break with Great Britain. And the arguments that Thomas Paine used in his book Common Sense, he made two biblical arguments, one based upon 1 Samuel chapter 8, and the other one on render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's. So from both the Old Testament and the New Testament, you had Thomas Paine making a biblical argument for separation from Great Britain. And some have said if Thomas Paine hadn't written Common Sense, there wouldn't have been a legitimacy to the fact of breaking away from Great Britain. But because he had quoted the Bible, you could make the justification for it. Mm-hmm. But then later on, he comes out with his book, The Age of Reason, and essentially, dismissed that and said biblical revelation was wrong and all that. Mm-hmm. But he made the case initially for it based upon the Bible. And the interesting thing, Thomas Paine was not well regarded after that. Hardly anybody ever went to his funeral. He was called a blackguard by, I think it was John Adams. Mm-hmm. Because he had just gone into a completely different direction. And there was a book that came out in response to his Age of Reason, and it was Elias Boudinot who came out with a book called The Age of Revelation. The Age of Reason shown to be an age of infidelity. Mm. And American Vision has published that as well. So here you have the 18th century, a lot going on. And while not everyone was a Christian, while the Enlightenment had made inroads into the founding, some of the founding documents and so forth, fundamentally, Christianity prevailed everywhere. To the point today, if you pick up every constitution, you will find a reference to God, Almighty God being the one, I think, the phrase that's used more than any other phrase. All 50 of them. Mm-hmm. And so when the ACLU or Americans United for Separation of Church and State come into a school system and say, hey, you can't pray or you can't mention God in the classroom and so forth, the constitutions of those states say otherwise. And it's interesting, you'll find states not willing to take a stand in this area. Part of the reason is it costs money. The ACLU comes in with all their lawyers and forces this compliance, and then they say, well, it's going to cost us $100,000 or $200,000 to defend this, and school budgets are low, and so there's no defense that takes place. And so this is where we are today. People generally don't have an understanding of America's Christian heritage. It's not in their schools. It's not in the textbooks. There's a lot of fiction in textbooks. For example, there was criticism regarding Christianity because, Christopher Columbus made his voyages because he wanted to prove that the world was round, where everybody in that day believed that the world was flat. And this was a belief that Christians believed that the world was flat, and Columbus came along and said, I'm going to prove the world was round. That's just complete fiction.
Yeah, none of that is real.
You go back and you look at the standard scientific historians of that day. Encyclopedia Britannica and so forth, you will find that this flat Earth myth was in all that, and these two particular secularists wrote these books dealing with the relationship between Christianity and science, and brought up the flat Earth myth to them all. Mm. And then when I was in school, that's what the kids were taught. Oh, it was bad in those days. You couldn't. People thought they were going to fall off the face of the earth and all. That just was not true. Mm-hmm. The problem was in that in shipping, is that once you lost sight of land, you had to navigate by other means, and the stars and so forth, which Columbus in fact did. Mm-hmm. So all of this, culminated in me sitting down and saying, well, let me work through the truth about America's Christian heritage, without dismissing the fact that not everyone was a Christian, mm-hmm. and some Enlightenment principles have entered into our history. Mm-hmm. And you have to deal with the fact that the Constitution of the United States is different from the state constitutions, because God is not mentioned directly in the preamble to the Constitution. Mm-hmm. Although there are a couple of things within the Constitution that are specifically Christian. You get a couple of ideas. Debts had to be paid by the states in terms of gold and silver. That's a biblical idea. 2 witnesses in a trial, biblical idea. Mm-hmm. Sunday is set aside as a day of rest for the President of the United States. A lot of people didn't know that. It's written into the Constitution of the United States that the President of the United States has 10 days in order to evaluate a bill that comes before him from Congress. And he has 10 days in order to make a decision. But Sundays are accepted. Hmm. That is, Sundays don't count. The reason is because Sunday was set aside as a day of rest for Christianity. It's not Friday, it's not Saturday, it's Sunday. Mm-hmm. And then the Constitution ends with, this was done in the year of our Lord, 1787.
Right, acknowledging the year of our Lord.
Yeah, and then people say, oh, and you'll see the ACLU and others, say, well, that was conventional for the time. And I agree, it was conventional for the time. And I think that's the point.
You've hit the proverbial point.
Right, yeah. And the reason it was put in there, because it was standard on all documents, and it wasn't standard on all documents because, let's just put this in there. People really believed that was fundamental to how the nation should be grounded. It was a transcendental, external authority in terms of how a nation should live. And the reason it's so important to bring that up about done in the year of our Lord, 1787, is to compare it with the French Revolution. Because the French Revolution pretty much took place at the same time. But that revolution...
You cover that pretty well in your book. You talk
about I do.
How in this book that we're talking about, you mention that what's going on over in France at this time, and it is radically different.
Oh, it is.
Yeah.
The French Revolution... They were, in fact, children of the Enlightenment, mm-hmm. so much so that they wanted to get rid of everything related to Christianity.
They were so enlightened they wanted to cut everybody's head off with a guillotine.
Yes, yeah. I mean, it was a spectacle. It was entertainment.
Mm-hmm, absolutely.
Where people would go to the town square, and they would sit, and the women would knit while they're watching. Bringing anybody related to the king, even a cook, or somebody who shined the shoes of a king would be brought and be executed by the guillotine. And so that didn't happen in the colonies. Mm-hmm. And another thing related to done in the year of our Lord, 1787, was also done the Sunday being set aside as a day of rest for the President of the United States. The French actually restarted the calendar with a year 1.
I read that.
Yeah.
That sounds really confusing to me.
It is.
Yeah.
In fact, if
you put a side-by-side comparison in the illustrated edition.
Right. And they went from a 7-day week to a 10-day week.
10-day, yeah.
Completely renamed everything, mm-hmm. although the names of the days of the week for us really aren't biblical, other than the first day of the week. But Sunday's named after the sun, and you've got the moon, Monday named after the moon, you've got mm-hmm. Thor's Day named after Thor, and so forth. So there still are a lot of these other elements that in our culture. But no one believed in these ancient gods as the result of the calendar. But the French made it a real specific idea. Start off with a brand new year one, restart the week calendar with a 10-day week. Can you imagine a 10-day week?
Yeah.
Today we might be working 7 days and then you get
I mean, as
3
an
days
employer,
off.
that sounds awesome, but I would.
Yeah.
No, but.
And the thing is, they had to create complementary calendars in order to figure out where you were in the rest of the world, because almost everybody else in the world was dealing with this 7-day week. They elevated reason as a god. They took this prostitute, dressed her up in Roman garb, and marched her to the Cathedral of Notre Dame and declared reason to be their goddess. I mean, it was so much different from the Americas. And they had the guillotine. Their blood literally ran in the streets. That did not happen in the colonies at that time. Now, we can debate about the war for independence. Maybe that wasn't the best way to go, but it was nothing like what took place in France. And over time, of course, they got rid of the calendar. They got rid of they also got rid of the guillotine.
Yeah.
But they went back to a 7-day week, and they went back to the basic calendar, the 12-month calendar that we have today.
I wanted to, something that you'd said in your book, and this is a quote, because I want to get, now we understand the background of why you wrote the book, or like what brought you to write the book. But you said here, quote, "If we are ever to restore what is about to be lost, we will need to learn the truth about our nation's founding. A look at some of the earliest colonies is a good starting point," end quote. And I liked what you said there, if we are ever to restore, because we have lost a lot.
Right, we have, yes.
And so I wanted to look just a little bit at the early colonies. Not a lot, but just a little bit, especially John Smith. It's something that I did not know, that I learned here. And I say, your recognition of what is about to be lost is paramount, and we are in fact about to lose what our founding fathers fought so hard to bring into being. But one of the key things that I took away from the Virginia colony at Jamestown was when John Smith became president of the colony on September 10th, 1608, and required greater discipline of the colonists, announcing a policy based on 2 Thessalonians 3:10, that, quote, "He that will not work shall not eat, except by sickness, or he be disabled." And here's why. This was so fascinating. The colonists were preoccupied with digging for gold.
Yeah.
Like they weren't feeding themselves. They were out there digging for gold because I guess they had gold fever.
Well, okay, you have to remember that there were different reasons why people were coming to the colonies. And there were different types of people who were coming to the colonies. Not all of them were Christians on, say, on the Mayflower. And so, and also, anytime an expedition is funded by the government, the king gets his fifth. He gets his 20%. So there were a lot of secularists, just downright criminals or criminal-like people that came over as well. Some of these expeditions were subsidized to a certain extent, but some of the colonists had to make money in order to send it back to the king. And also you'll find the same type of thing with William Bradford. They had started their colony, and it was a socialistic colony. And as a result, what happens in a socialistic colony? Some people work, some people don't work. But the problem was that the people who didn't work were getting the same fruit of everyone else's work, and that didn't last long, because the people who were working studiously, and they were working with hard work, all their family members were bringing in a lot, and some of their compatriots are over there not doing anything, but they were getting the same amount. And so these people said, well, we're not going to work as hard as we thought we were working before, because we're not getting the fruit of our labor. So that almost killed that particular colony as well.
Yeah, you heard it here first, folks. Gary DeMar just said Christianity and socialism do not work.
They do not.
They do not work, and I agree with you on that.
And you'll find, you always hear this story about teachers and professors saying, here's what we're going to do. We're going to have a test, and we're just going to average the grades. And so the people who are getting A's and people who are getting B's and C's and D's, we're going to take those all together. So like a 4, 3, 2, 1. We're going to take all those and we're going to average those. And then everybody's going to get the same grade. Well, the people who are studying to get A's and people who are studying to get B's decided, well, I'm not going to study as much because I'm just going to get the same grade as everyone else is going to get. And of course, everybody ends up flunking.
Yes.
And with these, in this case, people were starving to death.
Right.
And the Jamestown colony was a little more difficult because of where they ended up landing. But it was hard work. I mean, whole families ended up dying as a result of coming over here. I mean, they really didn't know what they were going to encounter. The Mayflower colony, they were supposed to end up in Virginia, and because of the weather, they end up in Massachusetts. Didn't have any idea what that was like.
Right.
So yeah, finally the colonists turned to the Bible with all of this and said, look, you don't work, you don't eat. And unfortunately, we've lost that today. We've got this. We have an entire welfare system where literally tens of millions of people don't work, and they get paid anyway. And a time comes when a nation begins to realize it's just not worth working the way I'm working when the government comes in and takes out 20, 30, or 40% of my wages in order to pay for all of this. And there was a time in the United States where we didn't have an income tax.
Right.
Now, prior to the income tax, we were doing pretty good. And then you had the so-called robber barons, come along and said, well, what we need to do, we'll start an income tax, but that income tax will be very, very, very small. And as a result of that, the only people who really pay it will be the really, really rich people. Well, how long did that last?
Yeah.
Because of inflation, because the government comes in and inflates, that is just adding money to the fake money to the economy, decreases the value of the money, and so what ends up happening, we got to get paid more because now money's worth less and less and less. And so we are, today we're being taxed, some people are being taxed 30, 35%. Well, the original income tax, people who voted for it thought only the really super rich people were going to have to pay it. And that was the same thing in the colonies. There were some people who felt it was okay to live off the work of other people, off of the productivity of other people. And back then, many of these people would starve to death. Today, we have the welfare system that comes in, and we just print money, continue to value money, and we end up people now dependent upon the government in order to subsist in our nation today. So.
And we just have to remind everyone that it's by saying depending upon the government, you're really depending upon everyone else that is working.
Oh yeah,
that's really what it boils down to.
It really is. And today we're here in the Georgia area, and we're outside of Atlanta. The biggest problem we're facing today is you go into a lot of these stores and they won't go in there to work. The reason is because a lot of what they're getting in terms of welfare pays them more than what they can make, per hour. And so people come along and say, well, we need to pay more per hour in order to do this. And so you end up paying them more per hour, and then what happens is now the people who are making about what now the minimum wage is, they say, well, we're not minimum wage employees anymore. We want paid more than that, and it just keeps going up and up and up and up and up. And one of the problems is the reason we're in the financial fix we are today is, number one, government programs, and number two, inflation. Inflation isn't higher prices. Inflation is adding to the money supply when it's really not money. At least those who were digging for gold were digging for real money.
Right.
No one digs for, very few people dig for gold today. We get paper money in digits, and the government comes in, and now we're in like $32 trillion in debt. It's devaluing our money. Can't buy houses. We can't hire people, and so forth. So this all goes back to a biblical idea. The Constitution of the United States makes it clear that states had to pay their debts in gold and silver. And we had in our nation gold and silver. Government comes along under the Roosevelt administration, what ends up happening? Turn in all your gold, turn in all your gold. Why to do that? So they could inflate. And we used to have silver up until 1963, but now none of the only legitimate piece of coinage we have today that still hasn't been debased is probably the penny made out of copper. But all of these principles are biblical principles. The book of Isaiah talks about, I think it's Isaiah chapter 1, your silver has become dross and your wine diluted with water. That's what our government does today.
Right.
And it's destroying our nation. There's going to be a tipping point with all this. And so our founders understood these basic principles. That's why they established gold and silver, biblical ideas, put it into the Constitution, and made it part of our monetary system.
Well, so I'm really curious. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself here because this is a two-parter. But you right after this, you said that we're preoccupied with digging for gold. There was no talk, no hope, no work, but dig gold, refine gold, load gold. And then one colonist remembered, then by what was understood by them to be the absolute providence of God, the indigenous people around Jamestown brought food for them. So I guess the sickness and everything had made this colony reduced pretty small to about 50, yes. Right? And so, and John Smith is here at this time. I guess the gentlemen that were out digging for gold and only focusing on gold, things had gotten pretty bad. And I guess the indigenous people noticed this. I don't know how this all came about, but they helped them.
They did, yeah. The same thing in the Massachusetts Bay area as well.
Right.
Some of the farming techniques that the Native Americans had used taught the colonists. And for one of the examples was you plant corn and you put a piece of fish in with a corn as a fertilizer. So yeah, you're right. I mean, the Native Americans at that particular period of time knew how to live off the land. That was the only way to live. And a lot of the colonists came over here really weren't farmers in that sense. Many of them were tradesmen. Maybe they could build a house and so forth, but farming was very, very difficult for many of them because they didn't have the techniques in order to do that. So this is another, I think, myth we find among that there were Native Americans and the colonists who did in fact get along, and there were some Native Americans that did not because just like today, there was no single Native American tribe. They warred against one another as well. So yes, early on, one of the reasons that the colonies were able to survive is because the Native American population came in and helped them out.
Sure, and that was, to me, we're doing this for Thanksgiving. This is a series that we're doing at the Thanksgiving time, and so to hear that, I've heard so many stories, much like you said, Columbus, went around to discover that the world was round instead of being flat. There was a lot of people today that are, like, for instance, they talk about Israel and Hamas and Palestine and what's going on, and how, as America, how we rooted a lot of the Native Americans out of their land, and how, and I just wanted to point out that early on that it wasn't just the white people that were just taking out. There was a lot of working together early on. Right.
Sure. Yeah, there was, and look, again, we need to be honest about this. There were people who mistreated the Indians at that, what were called Indians at that time, and that was wrong.
Right.
In biblical terms, that was wrong.
It was wrong according to the Bible.
Right.
Yes.
And we kind of forget that. And there's another aspect to all of this, but this was something that the colonists did not know. And that is disease.
Right.
In Europe, there was, smallpox was prevalent in Europe at that time. And the people who survived developed an immunity to smallpox. And so they come over here, they meet with this, Native American population that had no idea. The colonists and the Native Americans had no idea anything about, the germ basis or viruses and so forth. This is long before a microscope was developed enough that anybody could know anything was going on. They didn't understand any of that. And so when the colonists came, many Native Americans were killed because of smallpox. In fact, the Indians were confused because it was called smallpox, and it should have been called big pox because it was devastating to the Native American population. But you can't blame the Europeans for that. They didn't know that this was happening.
Right.
And there were even some who maintained, well, this was a kind of a good thing to get rid of this native population. My point in dealing with America's Christian history is to tell the whole story, all good, bad, and the ugly. I think is important to do that. But we have to come back to, it's not just the historical ideas that are important to us. It's what is the basis of what makes a civilization righteous. And we need to learn from the mistakes of the past. And if we're going to change the world in which we live, we've got to get back to those foundational principles. It's not enough just to study history and say, oh, they were Christians at that time and America was founded as a Christian nation, and let's just go ahead forward with that. We need to find those operating biblical principles in order to make the changes that are necessary to go forward in time.
Yeah, and I agree. I think this is a good place to end our first part. When we get into our second part, I want to talk about Oglethorpe in Georgia. I think that was he's an interesting man. And with what you just said about Christianity in our early phase in our nation, there were certain times when, biblically speaking, we were a Christian nation, but there were people who were taking us and doing things that were outside of our biblical principles, which shaped the way that our countries, for instance, slavery. And Georgia, your state where you live in, was a big factor in that, but it wasn't when it first started. So I wanted to cover that in the second part.
Okay.
All right.